Hello everyone and welcome to Lesson 8, Risk Response and Recovery. In this chapter, we're going to describe the principles of risk management, common response techniques, and issues related to recovery of IT systems. Some of our key concepts: quantitative and qualitative risk assessment approaches, business impact analysis, business continuity plan, incident handling, and disaster recovery plans. Organizations must constantly cope with change. Shareholders exert new pressures, governing bodies pass new legislation and set new standards. Organizations must maintain supply chains connecting their suppliers and their customers. Staying competitive means developing strategies to meet business goals. Responding to these changes might require that the organization shift personnel, alter the IT organization, and rearrange logistics. Any of these changes increases risk. The structure of your organization reflects its culture. Likewise, the culture affects your organization's commitment to protecting information and the people and infrastructure that support it. The way your organization manages risk reflects the value the organization puts on its assets. If the risk isn't considered serious, your organization isn't likely to invest much effort in addressing it. The amount of resources your organization is willing to expend to protect sensitive data affects the risk. Perhaps your organization understands that a specific risk is important, but it simply doesn't have enough budget to address the risk. Or perhaps your organization has a disposable culture seeking only short-term gains. It may choose to cease operation under adversity. If so, it will likely take only the bare minimum steps to meet required standards. If, however, your organization is committed to long-term success, it will invest in cost-effective plans to reduce risk. Either strategy might be a good fit for a particular organization. The only mistake is not matching risk management spending to the company's culture. For example, a disposable organization should not invest in a sustainable plan and vice versa. Risk management is a central concern of information security. Every action an organization takes or fails to take involves some degree of risk. Attention to risk management can mean the difference between a successful business and a failing business. That doesn't mean you eliminate every risk. Instead, organizations should seek a balance between the utility and cost of various risk management solutions or options. Different organizations have different risk tolerances. For example, an established hospital seeks to limit risk to the highest degree possible. On the other hand, a new startup business with only a handful of employees may be more willing to take on risks that may result in attractive financial returns. As a security professional, you will work with others to identify risks and apply risk management solutions. You must remember two key risk management principles. First, don't spend more to protect an asset than it's worth. This can be more difficult than it first appears. You must understand the true impact of each risk. Security breaches can degrade customer confidence. A successful attack may result in immediate cost, but also cause customers to go to a competitor. The true cost can be far higher than immediate cleanup costs. A countermeasure without a corresponding risk is a solution seeking a problem. It is difficult to justify the cost. You play an important role in the risk response and recovery aspects of information security. You must help identify risks. Some of them are serious and could put your company out of business. For example, a data breach could hurt your company's reputation and result in lost sales and may even end up costing a lot of money due to fines or settlements. You also must help create and or maintain a plan that makes sure your company continues to operate in the face of disruption. This type of plan is a business continuity plan, or a BCP. It is an important concept you're going to learn about in this lesson. Disruptions do happen, so you must expect they will happen to your organization. Planning for disruption is part of your role as a security professional. You must help develop and maintain a disaster recovery plan, or DRP, to help address situations that damage or destroy necessary parts of your infrastructure. As a security professional, your goal is to make sure your systems quickly become available to users after an outage and that you recover any lost or damaged data. However, you also play a role in making sure you handle the recovery process correctly. Managing risk is the process of identifying risks and deciding what to do about them. The first step in managing risk is identifying and assessing risk. But what is risk and how are risks assessed? Before you learn about managing risk, it is important to understand a few terms. The following terms describe risk assessment types or ways to define and discuss risk. First, we have threat. A threat is something generally bad that might happen. A threat could be a tornado hitting your data center or an attacker stealing your database of customer data. Next is vulnerability. A vulnerability is any exposure that could allow a threat to be realized. Some vulnerabilities are weaknesses, and some are just side effects of other actions, such as allowing employees to use their smartphones to connect to the corporate network. Next is a risk. Risk is the likelihood that a particular threat will be realized against a specific vulnerability. Most risks lead to possible damage or a negative result that could damage your organization. Not all risks are inherently bad. Some risks can lead to positive results. The extent of damage or even positive effect from a threat determines the level of risk. And finally is impact. Impact refers to the amount of harm a threat exploiting a vulnerability can cause. For example, if a virus infects a system, the virus could affect all the data on the system. When a threat is realized, an organization experiences either an event or an incident. An event is a measurable occurrence that has an impact on the business. Some events have little effect. Others might escalate into incidents. An incident is any event that either violates or threatens to violate your security policy. For example, employee warehouse theft is an incident. Incidents are events that justify a countermeasure. You will learn more about controls, countermeasures, and safeguards later in this lesson. Many people use these terms interchangeably, although there are subtle differences. They will also reduce risk by reducing either a vulnerability or the impact of a threat. Controls include both safeguards and countermeasures. Suffice it to say here that controls are actions taken to limit or constrain behavior. Safeguards address gaps or weaknesses in the controls that could otherwise lead to a realized threat. Countermeasures counter or address a specific threat. A fire sprinkler system is an example of a countermeasure. Assets, vulnerabilities, and threats are all elements of risk. These are component parts rather than a formula. Assets increase or decline in value. Your proactive procedures to discover and address vulnerabilities. New threats emerge to add to existing ones. As these factors change over time, risk changes as well. You should periodically perform risk assessments to identify new or changed risks. Don't assume that all threats come from the outside. In 2014, CSO Magazine, the CERT program, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, Microsoft, and the U.S. Secret Service released the latest Cybersecurity Watch survey. This report explained that insider attacks made up a little more than a quarter, which was 28% of all reported attacks. Other sources, including FBI and Verizon's 2015 data breach investigations report, stated that insider attacks made up just over 20% of overall attacks. However, the impact is proportionally worse. Insider attacks are also becoming more sophisticated. In 2013, NASA shut down its internal database and tightened its remote access policies. These actions were a direct result of suspected intellectual property theft carried out by a foreign national contractor. And it's gotten even worse in the last few years up to now in 2021. New threats appear all the time. The United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or US CERT, regularly releases information on new threats via email. You can subscribe to its technical cybersecurity bulletins or cybersecurity alerts through their website, www.us-cert.gov/ncas/alerts. Once you sign up, you'll receive regular email alerts. You can also subscribe to its news feed or follow it on Twitter. The purpose of risk management is to identify possible problems before something bad happens. Early identification is important because it gives you the opportunity to manage those risks instead of just reacting to them. It is important to identify risks before they lead to an incident, in time to enable you to plan and begin risk handling activities, which means putting controls and countermeasures in place, and on a continuous basis across the life of the product, system, or project. You can never reduce risk to zero. After identifying the risk culture of an organization, you need to evaluate risks and then handle the ones that could have a major effect on the organization first. You must be able to justify the cost of risk handling methods. In many cases, small risk reductions have significantly high costs. Part of your job is to identify the tolerable risk level and apply controls to reduce risk to that level. You must focus some risk management efforts on identifying new risks so you can manage them before a negative event occurs. Part of this process will include continually reevaluating risks to make sure you have put the countermeasures in place, at least the right countermeasures. This figure shows the risk management process. Risk management is a process that never really ends. It is important to periodically move through the complete cycle to be ready for current threats. The process defines how you will carry out the steps of managing risk for your organization. For example, the approach could state the risk analysis will be conducted at specified intervals. The tools for conducting this analysis can include the documents that define, categorize, and rank risks. This approach is consistent with the Project Management Institute's Project Management Body of Knowledge, or we call it the PMBOK. Though the PMI approach isn't the only way to do things, it does provide a prescriptive approach to project management in general, including risk management. The steps in the risk management process are as follows. First, we identify risks. The first step to manage your risks is knowing what they are or identifying them. What could go wrong? Answers include fire, flood, earthquake, lightning strike, loss of electricity or other utility, labor strikes, and transportation unavailability. You must develop scenarios for each threat to assess the risks. Next is assessing risks. Some risks pose a greater possibility of loss than others. Furthermore, not all risks apply to all businesses in all locations. For example, businesses in Montana or Moscow don't need to worry about hurricanes. Of the risks that are possible, impact would be more or less severe depending on the scenario and the location. Assessing risks is about determining which risks are the most serious ones. Next, we plan a risk response. Starting with the highest priority risk, we explore potential responses to each one. With direction from your organization's upper management, you determine the responses to each risk that provide the best value. Then we do implementation of the risk responses. We take action to implement the chosen responses to each risk from the previous step. And then last, we monitor and control risk responses. We monitor and measure each risk response to ensure that it's performing as expected. This step can include passive monitoring and logging as well as active testing to see how controls behave. The first step, as I said before, in the risk management process is to identify those risks. Organizations use many different methods to identify risks. Each method uses a different approach to solve the same problem, identifying as many risks as possible. In each, the basic strategy is to use input from multiple sources to build a comprehensive list of risks. Some of the more popular risk identification methods include these. First, we have brainstorming. This technique involves getting unstructured input from members in a group meeting. The facilitators should encourage all members to offer suggestions without fear of criticism or ridicule. Next are surveys. Organizations that use this technique send lists of prepared questions to participants for input. A variety of people from different areas of the organization should be chosen to get the best input. The Delphi method is a specific type of survey in which responses are anonymized, shuffled, and sent back out to participants for comment. Keeping input anonymous fosters more open dialogue. Next are interviews. Interviews held in either group settings or one-on-one can be an effective approach to gather details on risk from the interviewee's perspective. Next are working groups. This technique focuses on soliciting feedback from a group of individuals selected from a specific work area. The feedback working groups provide generally help identify risks in specific areas. Next are checklists. Many organizations develop checklists of risks for either their own use or for general distribution. Checklists developed for similar organizations or purposes can be helpful to ensure that you cover the breadth of risks. And finally is historical information. Unless an organization is brand new, it will have some historical information at its disposal. The information may be previously encountered risk identification process, or it may be documentation of things that went wrong in the past. Either way, historical information can be valuable to identify current risks. Most organizations use multiple methods to identify risks. Use the methods that work best for your organizational culture. The most important factor is to engage as many people from different functional areas as possible. The best outcome is to identify far more reasonable risks than your organization can handle. Although that sounds like you're asking for trouble, it is much better than completely missing important risks. Try using as many risk identification methods as possible to find the best mix of methods for your organization. The result of the risk identification process is a list of identified risks. The PMI calls this list the risk register. The risk register can contain many different types of information, but should contain at least the following: a description of the risk, the expected impact if the associated event occurs, the probability of the event occurring, steps to mitigate the risk, steps to take should the event occur, and ranking of the risks. Part of your risk identification activities should address new and emerging threats. These types of threats can come from many different areas and from both internal and external sources. Some examples of emergent threat include the following. You have new technology. You have changes in the culture of the organization or environment. You have unauthorized use of technology, for example, wireless technologies, rogue modems, smartphones, tablets, unlicensed software. You have changes in regulations and laws, and you have changes in business practices like outsourcing or globalization. A proactive security professional watches for new threats that might trigger the need for a new risk review. Two of the most common areas of emergent threats are cloud and virtualization. As organizations move toward outsourcing data and processing to cloud service providers, they encounter new threats. Some threats apply to cloud service providers. Others are generally related to internal or external users or virtualization. These threats can include things like violation of virtualization barriers, lack of access control for outsourced resources, reliability of cloud virtualization services, cloud service providers lock-in, and insecure application program interfaces, or APIs. Also, malicious insiders and account hijacking are threats. Although any of these threats I just mentioned may occur in all environments, the risk in a cloud or virtualized environment is of greater concern due to the common practice of delegating responsibilities of these environments to external partners. Always consider new and novel threats when considering cloud or virtualized services. Another class of threats bearing closer examination relates to static environments. Static environments are types of systems that don't change very much or at all after deployment. While normal or dynamic systems do change often, static systems tend to remain much like they were when first installed. Some examples of static systems include supervisory and data acquisition, which we call SCADA. SCADA systems are common in industrial settings. SCADA systems control and monitor physical devices such as manufacturing, power generation, oil, water, and gas distribution, and facility environmental controls. These systems are often built by the manufacturer with static versions of an operating system and other software to produce a fixed software stack. SCADA systems are not easy to patch when security vulnerabilities are discovered in one of its embedded software layers. Next, we have embedded systems. These are generally small computers that are contained in a larger device. The computer components are often enclosed in a chassis that houses the rest of the device. Such devices can include other hardware and mechanical parts. For example, a robotic vacuum device contains an embedded system that controls its movement. The embedded computer is not easily accessible and is difficult to update with security patches. Next is mobile devices like Android or Apple or Windows. Mobile operating system patches and upgrades are available and easy to apply, but not all users update their devices. Bad prior upgrade experiences may prevent users from applying needed patches. This can lead to threats to unpatched mobile endpoints. In addition, many mobile devices are beyond the control of the organizations to which they connect. Next are mainframes. These large computers exist primarily in large organization data centers. They handle large-scale data processing and are expensive to maintain. Downtime is expensive and discouraged. For that reason, there isn't much opportunity to apply security patches until a downtime window approaches. Mainframes may operate as vulnerable to emergent threats for some time. Next are gaming consoles. These are usually just computers that are optimized to handle graphics applications efficiently. Today's gaming consoles are commonly connected to the internet and are routinely exposed to new threats. Many manufacturers do provide security patches, but not all users are diligent about keeping their systems updated. Most users just want to plug in their consoles and play. Finally are vehicle systems. This final category of static systems is a type of embedded system. Increasing numbers of vehicles contain computing systems that monitor conditions, provide connectivity to the internet, provide real-time routing, and even control the vehicle's operation. For example, automatic parking and self-driving cars. Intervention systems to enhance safety are included in more and more new vehicles. For example, anti-lock braking and anti-collision systems are available on many models. These systems tend to be very difficult to upgrade or patch due to the effort required to take the vehicle to a service agent who can perform such maintenance. If manufacturers make the update process too easy, attackers could easily inject malicious code into it. Part of your risk identification process should include these static systems. These systems encounter threats just like other systems. Addressing threats to these type of systems may be more difficult, but a secure system depends on the security of all its components. A good risk assessment explains the company's risk environment to managers in terms they understand. It explains what risks could stop a company from operating. Sometimes IT professionals get so emotional about protecting their IT structure, they forget that their systems are there to support the organization's primary objectives. During the risk assessment process, remain focused on what does this mean to the company and what is the value of this to the company, rather than what does this mean for my systems and infrastructure. Although you have many choices to respond to risk, a key reason for risk management or risk assessment is to provide the data necessary to identify the best response choices. That depends on such things as cost, effectiveness, impact on productivity, and user acceptance. Two approaches to risk assessment are qualitative and quantitative. Let's begin with quantitative risk assessment. This type of risk assessment attempts to describe risks in financial terms and put a dollar value on each risk. It is more objective than a qualitative analysis. One drawback to this approach is that many risks have values that are difficult to measure. These include reputation and the availability of countermeasures. Exact numbers can be difficult to determine, especially the cost of the impact of future events. On the other hand, quantitative risk assessments are easier to automate than qualitative assessments. Quantitative analysis puts a dollar figure on risks. Qualitative analysis defines risk based on the severity of their impact and/or probability. This figure you see on this slide compares quantitative and qualitative risk analysis. Neither approach is perfect in itself. A solid risk assessment often combines both techniques. Let's now look at qualitative risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessment ranks risks based on their probability of occurrence and impact on business operations. Impact is the degree of effect a realized threat will pose. Impact is often expressed from low, which is insignificant, to high, which is catastrophic values. Qualitative risk assessments can be fairly subjective, but they do help determine the most critical risks. This type of assessment requires diverse input from people who work on different departments and encourages the use of relative terms. For example, a qualitative assessment asks which risks are worse than others. This allows the business units and technical experts to understand the ripple effects of an event on other departments or operations. In most situations, you can combine the two methodologies. Qualitative risk analysis gives you a better understanding of the overall impact the disruption will have as the effects ripple through an organization. It often leads to better communication between departments in terms of how they must work together to reduce damage. However, it lacks some of the solid financial data of quantitative risk analysis. You often need this cost information to justify the cost of countermeasures. Therefore, you need to consider both techniques. Let's talk about calculating quantifier risks. To calculate quantifier risk, you must figure out how much an asset is worth and the probability that you encounter a loss. This is the event's loss expectancy. Calculating is a multi-step process. First, we calculate the asset value. An asset is anything of value to an organization. Assets can be tangible, like buildings, or intangible, like your reputation. A first step in risk assessment is to determine all the organization's assets and their value. That is, the importance of each asset to the organization's ability to meet its mission. Asset value should consider the replacement value of equipment or systems. It should also include factors such as lost productivity and loss of reputation or customer confidence. Next, we calculate the exposure factor. This represents the percentage of the asset value that would be lost if an incident were to occur. For example, not every car accident is a total loss. Insurance companies have actuaries who calculate the likely percentage loss for every claim. They know the cost of repairs for every make and model and can predict the exposure factor per claim. Their prediction won't be right for any single claim except by chance, but it will be right when grouped by the hundreds or the thousands. Next, we calculate the single loss expectancy. You can calculate the value of a single loss using the two preceding factors I spoke about. If an actuary calculates the exposure factor of a late model SUV is 20%, then every time he receives a claim, all he needs to do is look up the asset value, multiply it by the exposure factor, and he'll have a very good prediction of the payout. This allows the actuary to calculate insurance premiums accurately and reduce the risk of the insurance company losing money. Next, you determine how often a loss is likely to occur every year. This is called the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO we call it in the industry, also called the risk likelihood. Some AROs are greater than 1. For example, a snowstorm in Buffalo or Berlin will happen many times per year. Others are likely to happen far less often. For example, a warehouse fire might happen once every 20 years. It is often difficult to estimate how often an incident will happen. Sometimes internal or external factors can affect that assessment. Historical data do not always predict the future. An incident such as one stemming from an internal threat is far more likely during times of employee unrest or contract negotiations than at other times. Finally, we determine the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. The ALE is the SLE, the loss when an incident happens, times the ARO, which is the annualized rate of occurrence. The ALE helps an organization to identify the overall impact of a risk. For infrequent events, the ALE will be much less than the SLE. For example, if you expect an event to occur only once every 10 years, the ARO is 10%, or 0.10. If the SLE is $1,000, the ALE is only $100, which is 1,000 times 10%. On the other hand, if the ARO is 20, indicating that it's likely to occur 20 times every year, the ALE is $20,000, which is $1,000 times 20. This table shows the calculations you can use to determine quantified risk, and I just went over those with you. The purpose of calculating quantified risk is to find the highest amount that you should spend on a countermeasure. The cost of the countermeasure should be less than the ALE, or annualized loss expectancy. Consider this example. About 100 users in your organization use laptop computers, so listen closely and write this down. The value of each mobile computer is $1,500, which includes the cost of the computer, the software, and the data. In the past 2 years, the organization has lost an average of 6 computers a year. So this information enables you to calculate the SLE, the RO, and the ALE. So the SLE, and write this down, is $1,500. The ARO is 6, and the ALE is $9,000. Now, someone has suggested purchasing hardware locks as a countermeasure to protect against the loss of these systems. Users can use these locks to lock unattended computers to furniture, the way bicycle riders lock their bikes to a bike rack. If you purchase the locks in bulk, they cost $10 each. Additionally, if you purchase and use the locks, you estimate that you can reduce the losses from 6 per year to only 1. Is this a cost-effective countermeasure? Well, the cost of the countermeasure is $1,000 times $10 times 100 computers. So your new ARO is 1, which is you're only going to lose 1 per year, and your new ALE is only $1,500. So that's a big savings from that annual loss expectancy of $9,000. Clearly, this is a cost-effective control. Instead of losing that $9,000 a year, your organization spends $1,000 and only loses $1,500. The total outgoing funds is $2,500. Again, this is much better than the loss of $9,000 you experienced before implementing the new control. On the other hand, if the cost of the countermeasure were $20,000, it wouldn't make sense. You'd be spending $20,000 to potentially save $9,000, which would cost the organization an additional $11,000. Let's look at quantitative risk analysis. You can judge every risk on 2 scales. The probability or likelihood. Some things, for example, the malfunction of a badge reader on the employee entrance, will seldom happen. Other things, such as employees calling in sick, will almost certainly happen. Or you can look at the impact. Some things, for example, a workstation that fails to boot up will have a minor impact on productivity. Other things, such as a production system breaking down, will have a major impact. You should evaluate events with respect to both scales and then place them on a chart like the one in this figure here. Notice the quadrant labeled Focus Area for Risk Management. These are risks with both a high probability and a high impact. You should evaluate these risks first. You can reduce the probability of the risk or its impact if you apply countermeasures to these risks first. You should not confine your risk management activities solely to the upper right quadrant, but this is where your risk response efforts should focus. Risk mitigation, transference, acceptance, or avoidance, which I'm going to cover in a few minutes, reduce the risk in the upper right quadrant. As a reminder, the goal isn't to eliminate risk, but instead to reduce risk to an acceptable level. The next two steps of the risk management process are to develop a plan to handle risk and then implement that plan. As you develop risk management strategies, you should understand the most common responses. You can reduce, transfer, accept, and avoid each negative risk. Let's talk about each one of these. Reduce is reduction or mitigation. This approach uses various controls to mitigate or reduce identified risks. These controls might be administrative, technical, or physical. For example, adding antivirus software reduces the risk of computer infection. Next is transference or assignment. This approach allows the organization to transfer the risk to another entity. Insurance is a common way to reduce the risk. An organization sells the risk to an insurance company in return for a premium. Other times, you can transfer risk to insulate an organization from excessive liability. A hotel, for example, engages a separate car parking corporation to manage its parking lot. Losses are the primary responsibility of the car parking corporation, not the hotel. An incident in the parking lot is less likely to put the hotel in jeopardy of a lawsuit. Next is accept the risk or acceptance. This allows an organization to accept risk. The organization knows the risk exists and has decided that the cost of reducing it is higher than the loss would be. This can include self-insuring or using a deductible. The level of risk an organization is willing to accept depends on the risk appetite of senior management. For example, a physician buys malpractice insurance and accepts the residual risk of loss equal to the deductible. He can decide to pay an even higher premium to reduce his deductible, but he might decide that the higher premium will not be worth the cost because he expects to rarely make a claim. Finally, in this category is avoidance. Risk avoidance is just that, deciding not to take a risk. A company can discontinue or decide not to enter a line of business if the risk level is too high. With avoidance, management decides that the potential loss to the company exceeds the potential value gained by continuing the risky activity. For example, a company may decide not to open a branch in a country mired in political turmoil. Now, let's drop down to positive risk. For positive risk, you can exploit, share, enhance, or accept each risk. Let's look at exploitation first. When you exploit a positive risk, you take advantage of an opportunity that arises when you respond to that risk. For example, suppose your organization developed training materials for use within your organization to help you address a specific risk. You might exploit the risk by packaging and marketing those training materials to other organizations. Next is sharing. When you share a positive risk, you use a third party to help capture the opportunity associated with that risk. For example, banding with another organization to purchase a group of workstation licenses enables both organizations to realize a substantial discount due to the size of the combined order. In this case, the risk is that the license cost may change. Next is enhancement. When you enhance a positive risk, you increase the probability or positive impact of the event associated with the risk. For example, suppose you have a contract to deliver software that includes $20,000 bonuses for early completion. To enhance the positive risk, a delivery date that does not match your schedule, you might offer a subcontractor you've hired a $5,000 bonus for finishing ahead of the deadline. And finally is acceptance. When you accept a positive risk, you take no steps to address it because the potential effects of the risk are positive and add value. For example, suppose you have purchased a new automated backup and configuration utility that can help your organization deploy new workstations in half the allotted time. Because the utility is new, it may take some time to learn, meaning it may not help your organization save any time deploying new workstations. It's determined that at worst, learning the new utility and using it to manage deployments will take the same amount of time as doing it manually. However, if you realize the positive risk, you will finish deployment sooner than planned. The acceptable range of risk determines how you define activities and countermeasures. The upper bound is the risk impact where the cost would be too great for the organization to bear. The lower bound shows the increased cost of the countermeasures to handle the residual risk. This figure illustrates the goal of risk management is to stay inside the acceptable range. The top graph represents the total exposure to an organization for a specific risk. The in-place countermeasures are not adequate to reduce the risk from the maximum acceptable residual risk level into the acceptable range. The lower graph shows the proposed countermeasures that will reduce the maximum residual risk level to the acceptable range. Total risk is the combined risk to all business assets. Total risk is the combined risk to all business assets. Residual risk is the risk that remains after you have deployed countermeasures and controls. Risk minus mitigating controls equals residual risk. Applying countermeasures and controls reduces risk but does not eliminate it. Look at the example of car insurance again. When you purchase a brand new car, it loses value as soon as you drive it off the dealer's lot because it's now used. If an accident totals the car, insurance may not reimburse you the price you paid for the car originally. The difference between what the insurance company pays and what you actually pay for the car is the residual risk. Other examples include the deductible on insurance or the remaining but decreased chance of fire after you implement alarms, sprinkler systems, and training sessions. The difference between total risk and residual risk is shown in this figure. You should prepare your organization to accept the cost of residual risk. You may choose not to eliminate risk entirely because doing so is impossible or is too expensive. If this cost is too great, you must either eliminate the risky behavior or use a different countermeasure. Security controls are the safeguards or countermeasures that an organization uses to avoid, counteract, or minimize loss or system unavailability. As defined by the Institute of Internal Auditors, the control environment sets the tone of an organization, influencing the control consciousness of its people. It is the foundation for all other components of internal control, providing discipline and structure. Control environment factors include the integrity, ethical values, and competence of the entity's people, management's philosophy and operating style, and the way management assigns authority and organizes and develops its people. Some controls manage the activity phase of security, the things people do. These are administrative controls. Administrative controls develop and ensure compliance with policy and procedures. They tend to be things that employees might do, things employees are supposed to do, or things employees are not supposed to do. A control carried out or managed by a computer system is a technical control. Activity phase controls can be either administrative or technical. They correspond to the life cycle of a security program as follows. First, you have detective controls. These controls identify that a threat has landed in your system. An intrusion detection system is an example of a detective control. An IDS, intrusion detection system, can detect attacks on systems such as port scans that try to gain information about a system. The IDS then logs that activity. Next, you have preventative controls. These stop threats from coming in contact with a vulnerability. An example of a preventative control is an intrusion prevention system, or IPS. An IPS is an IDS that you configure to actively block an attack. Instead of simply logging the activity, it can change the configuration so that the malicious activity is blocked. Next, you have corrective controls. These reduce the effect of a threat. When you reload an operating system after it is infected with malware, you're using a corrective control. Forensics and incident response are other examples of corrective controls. Next, you have deterrent controls. These are controls that deter an action that could result in a violation. There's a fine line between deterrent controls and preventative controls. Deterrent controls merely attempt to suggest that a subject not take some action, whereas preventive controls do not allow the action to occur. Deterrent controls are valuable when a knowledgeable user needs the ability to perform some action that involves risk. A deterrent control would allow the action after a warning, whereas a preventive control would not allow the action. In short, the decision to choose between a preventative and deterrent control is often a balance between utility and security. Compensating controls. These controls are designed to address a threat in place of a preferred control that is too expensive or difficult to implement. Let's look at protecting physical security. One special class of risk to the organization is physical security. In fact, good physical security is necessary for a solid overall security plan. Too many IT security professionals dismiss physical security and focus only on technical security controls. Always assess the best security controls as part of your risk management program. You have to ensure that all critical IT assets are physically secured at all times. There are many controls you can implement to ensure physical security. Here on this slide is a partial list of the most common environmental and physical controls you need to maintain in IT security. You have your HVAC system, which is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. These are systems that provide proper airflow, temperature, and humidity for IT components to operate. Although this might seem straightforward, these systems must be designed well and operate efficiently to support your IT infrastructure. Data system design should include hot aisles for IT component heat venting and cold aisles for drawing cold air into its IT components. They must also be designed to provide necessary services at all times while using as little energy as possible to keep costs down. All environmental controls must be monitored for proper operation to ensure that your data center maintains the required temperature and humidity. Next is fire suppression. This includes devices and systems designed to extinguish fires of different types to minimize damage and stop fires from spreading. Next is EMI shielding. This includes physical barriers placed around wiring or into building materials to limit electromagnetic interference, which is what EMI is. Electromagnetic interference emanations from traveling outside protected areas. Next is lighting. Lights are placed to ensure all areas are well lit with few dark spots. You should have signs. Clear signage indicates which areas are designated for specific purposes and which areas are off limits. You should have video surveillance. These are devices that monitor many areas of your facility from a central location and record actions for later analysis. You should have access lists. These are lists of personnel authorized to access a physical resource. And you should have a safety plan. Other things you consider are things like fencing, barricades, guards, motion detectors, locks, man traps, proximity readers, biometrics, protected access, alarms, escape plans, escape routes, drills, control testing, and things like that. Selecting countermeasures. As I discussed earlier in this lesson, control, safeguard, and countermeasure are not interchangeable terms. A control limits or constrains behavior. Safeguards and countermeasures are controls that exercise restraint on or management of some activity. For example, a safe for storage of valuables is a control. A human guard who watches the safe is a safeguard. Insurance against loss of the valuables, if stolen, is a countermeasure. The countermeasure counters or addresses the loss from a specific incident. There is an unlimited number of possible countermeasures. A countermeasure must have a clearly defined purpose. It must address a risk and reduce a vulnerability. A countermeasure or control without an exposure or risk is a solution seeking a problem. Some specific purposes of countermeasures include the following: fix known exploitable software flaws, develop and enforce operational procedures and access controls, both data and system, provide encryption capability, improve physical security, and disconnect unreliable networks. Everyone needs to be aware of his or her security responsibilities. Security will be a full-time job for some people. Others will have only infrequent responsibilities, such as locking the door on the way out. Some specific security responsibilities that you may hold include the following: delete redundant guest controls, train system administrators with specific training, train everybody with general training, install virus scanning software, and install IDS, IPS, and network scanning tools. You must consider many factors when you are evaluating countermeasures. One is the product costs. The price of the product will include its base price, the price of additional features, and costs associated with the service level agreement or annual maintenance. You have to look at implementation costs. This refers to costs associated with changes to the infrastructure, construction, design, and training. An example is the cost of reinforcing a floor to install new equipment. Compatibility costs. The countermeasure must fit within or be compatible with the overall structure. For example, a Windows-only organization would have to carefully consider the additional costs associated with training and interoperability when installing a Linux-based countermeasure. Environmental costs. If, for example, a countermeasure uses a lot of energy, you would need to consider whether your electric system will be able to provide that energy and to offset the excess heat it's going to generate. Your testing costs. Testing does take time and money, but it's essential. Note, however, that testing also causes disruptions. You must consider all of these as costs. And productivity impact. Many controls affect productivity. They might generate more calls to the help desk, slower response time for users, and so on. The most important part of putting any control or countermeasure in place is making sure it meets its objectives. The last step in the risk management process is to monitor and control deployed countermeasures. A countermeasure is of no value if it does not actually provide its intended benefit. When evaluating a countermeasure, first ask, what problem is this countermeasure designed to solve? Your risk management plan should make this clear. Then ask, does this countermeasure solve this problem? Here are some other points that you want to consider. Countermeasures might pose a new risk to the organization. For example, implementing a countermeasure might create a false sense of security, or the countermeasure itself might become a new point of failure on a critical system. Make sure you continuously monitor the countermeasure, check it for compliance and good design, and perform regular maintenance. Second, you must perform certification and accreditation of countermeasure programs. No system, control, or application should go into production without first going through a change control process. This also applies to changes to existing production systems. You must review all controls and countermeasures before performing an installation or making changes. Otherwise, administrators might misconfigure the system or make other errors. And finally, you must follow best practices and exercise due diligence. A good risk management program tells auditors that the company is taking a prudent and diligent approach to security risks. Due diligence is exercised by frequently evaluating whether countermeasures are performing as expected. The way an organization responds to a disruption might well determine its survival. Poor planning greatly increases risk. With poor planning, an organization would not be able to respond appropriately and may be unable to return to normal operations. Planning for disruptions is part of business continuity management, which includes both of the following. You have business continuity plan, or BCP. This plan contains the actions needed to keep critical business processes running after a disruption. Disruptions can be minor, such as power outage, or major, such as weather damage that makes an organization's building unusable. And disaster recovery plan. This plan details the steps to recover from a disruption and restore the infrastructure necessary for normal business operations. BCM includes not only BCP and DRP, but also crisis management, incident response management, and risk management. A disruption is a sudden unplanned event. It upsets an organization's ability to provide critical business functions and causes great damage or loss. Examples of major disruptions include things like extreme weather, like Superstorm Sandy in 2012 is an example. Criminal activity. This might include the theft of credit card numbers or other customer data. Civil unrest or terrorist acts. One example is the wave of violent protests in Missouri in 2014 and all the things that's happening in 2020 and 21. Operational. An example is the electrical blackout in northern India in 2012, which affected nearly 9% of the world's population. And application failure. Two examples are Amazon's E2 Cloud Services crash in 2011 and Microsoft Cloud Services crash in 2014. Businesses that depended on these cloud services had to find other ways to perform business operations until their service was resolved. The purpose of business continuity management is to mitigate incidents and ensure continuity of operations. When an incident does occur, however, the first priority must always be to ensure the safety of people. Containing the damage is secondary. As a security professional, you must understand the following terms. First is a business impact analysis. This is an analysis of the business to determine what kinds of events will have an impact on what systems. You should not limit the focus of the BIA to the information systems department and infrastructure. A business with a supply chain disruption, warehouse fire, trucking strike, etc., could easily suffer a major impact that has nothing to do with technology at all. Some scenarios will affect some departments, some will affect others, and a critical few will affect the entire business. You will learn more about BIA later in this lesson. Critical business function, CBF. Once the BIA has identified the business systems that an incident will affect, you must rank the systems from most to least critical. That ranking determines whether the business can survive and for how long in the absence of a critical function. Next is maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. MTD is the most time a business can survive without a particular critical system. A major disruption is any event that makes a CBF unavailable for longer than its MTD. Each of the disaster planning and mitigation solutions must be able to recover CBFs within their MTDs. Systems and functions with the shortest MTDs are often the most critical. And soon I'm going to cover this topic in more detail. Next is recovery time objective, or RTO. RTO is the time frame for restoring a CBF. RTO must be shorter than or equal to the MTD. Next is recovery point objective, or RPO. Incidents can cause loss of data. You must calculate the amount of tolerable data loss for each business function. Recovery procedures must be able to meet the minimums defined here. If the business can afford to lose up to 1 day's data, then nightly backups might be an acceptable solution. However, if the business must prevent all data loss, a redundant server or storage solution will be required. Next is the Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. The EOC is the place where the recovery team will meet and work during a disruption. Many businesses have more than one emergency operations center. One might be nearby for use in the event of a building fire, for example. Another might be a significant distance away, for example, for use in the event of an earthquake or regional power outage. Here's how MTD and RTO work together. Suppose power goes out in the data center. It takes 6 hours to move to the alternate site, the RTO. The business can survive for 9 hours without a functioning data center. At this point, there's an event, but not yet an incident that you can define as a major disruption or disaster. If you expect power to return within 3 hours, that's MTD versus that RTO, the business might not declare disaster in anticipation that activity will resume normally. However, if power is still out at the 3-hour mark, it is time to declare a major disruption. In the example I just gave you, the 3-hour mark is a critical milestone. Imagine that the organization chose not to switch operations to the alternate site at the 3-hour mark. Instead, it waited 4 hours. Because it takes 6 hours to switch over to the alternate site, the organization will suffer a total loss of 10 hours. This is beyond the MTD of 9 hours. While a single hour may not seem like much, it is based on the established MTD. It may be that the data center provides services to other organizations. Service level agreements dictate outages no longer than 9 hours with monetary penalties for longer outages. That extra hour could cost the organization tens of thousands of dollars or even more. Of course, the best way to avoid ever being down longer than your MTD is to never be down in the first place. One important aspect of BCM is providing controls to avoid downtime whenever possible. IT contingency planning addresses how to handle components being out of service. But high availability planning addresses how to keep critical components operational at all times. High availability planning involves identifying any critical components and ensuring that their failure doesn't take the whole business process down. Any component that, if it fails, could interrupt business processing is called a single point of failure, or we're going to call it SPOF. One goal of BCM is to eliminate all critical SPOFs. For example, suppose your organization uses a single ISP. If the link to your ISP fails, you have no internet connectivity. One way to address the SPOF is by purchasing internet service from another ISP as well as your primary ISP. Deploying 2 or more components that are capable of providing the same service is called redundancy, and it helps to increase an organization's ability to avoid downtime, which is also called fault tolerance. You determine maximum tolerable downtime by business requirements. This is closely associated with the RTOs of several integrated functions. For example, consider a website hosted by an organization for purposes of e-commerce. The web servers depend on network services, ISP availability, and electricity. Each of these will have its own incident-dependent RTO, but it will be associated with the MTD. For example, if you determine that the website has an MTD of 4 hours, the RTO of the failed network services, ISP availability, and electricity all must be less than 4 hours. Parts of the recovery will be able to take place in parallel, but some might have to be sequential. In this example, you can't cover network services until you've restored the power. However, once you get power back on, you can work on restoring network services and ISP availability at the same time. The RPO defines the amount of tolerable data loss. The RPO can come from the business impact analysis or sometimes from a government mandate, for example. Banking laws or regulations pertaining to pharmaceutical research data retention is one type. The figure before you shows how to assess the MTD, RTO, and RPO. A BIA determines the extent of the impact that a particular incident would have on business operations over time. The BIA drives the choice of the recovery strategy and the CBFs. As a security professional, your job is to ask 2 questions. First, what can affect the business? And second, how will it affect the business? A successful BIA maps the context, the critical business functions, and the processes on which they rely. You should consider all impacts, including those that are hard to address or are less obvious. Different incidents require different recovery strategies. A fire in the accounting department might call for outsourcing and temporary quarters. A flood in the basement might activate a service bureau plan. An earthquake or hurricane might cause a permanent move to a new facility. You conduct a business impact analysis for 3 key reasons: to set the value of each business unit or resource as it relates to how the entire organization operates, to identify the critical needs to develop a business recovery plan, and to set the order or priority for restoring the organization's functions after a disruption. I want to talk about speed of impact. Some incidents might become more significant over time. The slow deterioration of a critical processing facility might generate a disaster. Continuous installation of new devices in a computer room might overtax the electrical supply capacity and eventually cause a blackout or a fire. Some systems are more important during certain times of the year. A company that supplies heating oil is busier in the winter. Even the smallest outage in the winter can jeopardize that company's service agreements. That same company might easily withstand far more severe incidents, which means longer MTDs in the summer when load is minimal. The BIA must identify what your organization needs to support a company's critical operations. That means information processing, personnel, communications, equipment, facilities, other organizational functions, vendors, and suppliers. The BIA will identify critical data and systems. Note that the importance of systems and the importance of data are not always the same. A system might be more critical than the data it contains and vice versa. What is truly important in those systems and data on which the business relies. Issues you should consider during the BIA fall under the following categories. First are people. How will you notify them of the incident and its impact? How will you evacuate, transport, and care for employees, including, for example, paying them? Who will step in if key personnel are incapacitated or unavailable? This is called succession planning. Second are systems. What portions of your computing and telecommunications infrastructure must you duplicate immediately? How long do you have? A minute? An hour? A day? Next are data. What data are critical to running your business? How will you recover critical data that are lost? And last is property. What items are essential to your business? Things like tools, supplies, and special forms all must be recoverable or easily replaced. Assessing the impact of downtime is a planning step in the BIA. You are helping to determine what must be done and in what order to accomplish the goals described in these four categories. Figuring out how to do this is the main thrust of your BCM. You must update and regularly maintain the BCP and the inventory and configuration list for the systems and applications. Some firms do this annually. Others choose different periods. In addition to the scheduled reviews, any major changes to the company should trigger a review. Besides the obvious benefit of having an up-to-date plan, testing and planning revisions are excellent ways to train new employees. Taking new employees through a hands-on process teaches them your procedures and more about your environment. Let's look at testing the plan. You should not accept any BCP or DCP without thorough testing. This helps ensure that the plan will work and that you will meet the CBF, MTD, RPO, and RTO objectives. Each stage of the test must consider the continued need for security and the technical resources required both to perform the test and to handle an actual disaster. Checklist tests. A checklist test is a simple review of the plan by managers and the business continuity team to make sure that contact numbers are current and that the plan reflects the company's priorities and structures. This kind of check is a desk check. Each team member checks his or her portion of the plan while sitting at his or her desk. As well as checking their contact list, team members review whether changes in their departments affect the plan. They also look at expected changes in their departments to see if they would trigger a need to update the plan. Next is structured walkthrough test. A structured walkthrough test is a tabletop exercise. During this test, a team of representatives from each department should do the following. They should present their portion of the plan to other teams, review the goals of the plan for completeness and correctness, affirm the scope of the plan as well as any assumptions made, look for overlaps and gaps, review the structure of the organization as well as the reporting and communication structure, evaluate the testing, maintenance, and training requirements, conduct a number of scenario-based exercises to evaluate the plan's effectiveness, and meet to step through the plan together in a structured manner. In the case of the final step, team members should act as though they are executing a plan for a certain type of incident. The goal of this structured walkthrough is to find errors in each department's plans, such as gaps or overlaps. Gaps are where one department is under the impression a critical task was to be handled by a different department. Overlaps are situations where two departments think they'll have exclusive or majority use of the same resource. For example, two departments think they'll have 2/3 of the replacement desktops. Next, we have a simulation test. A simulation test is more than a paper exercise. It requires more planning than a walkthrough. All the members of the staff involved in the operations/procedures participate in the test. The test identifies things like staff reaction and response times and inefficiencies or previously unidentified vulnerabilities. You should conduct a simulation on site using only countermeasures defined in the plan. The simulation test involves many of the employees who have not yet participated in plan development. It is common to conduct simulations on an off-duty day, such as a weekend. The purpose of the simulation test is to identify shortcomings. You should carry out the test as far as possible. If, for example, a critical file is missing, the file should be generated or obtained from the main site and the test should then continue. Ensure that you log any on-the-spot corrections for evaluation and plan to update them later. The test should end only when it is completed or if it becomes impossible to continue. Next is the parallel test. Most organizations conduct parallel tests at the alternate site. A parallel test is the same as a full interruption test, which I'm going to cover in a second, except that processing does not stop at the primary site. Here are a few key points with respect to parallel tests. A parallel test is an operational test, so it will not include representatives from HR, PR, purchasing, facilities, and things like that. Because a parallel test means activating the alternate site, it will cost a significant amount of money. The test must have senior management approval. Third, compare the results of the test with the processing at the original site. Fourth, a gap analysis exposes any weaknesses or underperformance that requires attention. And finally, usually auditors are involved at every step to monitor the success and to make sure the parallel run data are not mixed into the normal operational data. And finally, we have a full interruption test. The most common way to conduct this type of test is at the alternate site. This type of test is so disruptive that few organizations actually conduct it. During the test, you must shut down the original system for the duration. You can only use those processes that exist at the alternate site to continue the business operation. Recovery is possible only if the company has access to backups of its data and applications. Plans must include dealing with backup storage media, location, and access. Tape backup is the traditional choice for backup and still the most common. However, restoration from tape is slow, and many systems have RTOs that are shorter than the tape restore time. These kinds of sites often use disk-based solutions such as storage area network, called a SAN, or a network attached server called a NAS or NAS, or even an off-site network-based storage such as remote journaling. In remote journaling, the system writes a log of online transactions to an off-site location. The log updates a copy of the database. Should the primary site go down, the off-site copy would be current. Backups provide extra copies of needed resources such as data, documentation, and equipment. You can activate a backup site if a primary site goes down. Similarly, you can restore a backup site possibly at an alternate site. Then processing can resume. Backups and restores are slow. Businesses have three alternatives for processing them. First, you can do a full backup. As its name implies, this backup copies everything to a backup media. It is usually tape, but is sometimes CD, DVD, or disk. You can do a differential backup. With this type of backup, you start by making a full backup, perhaps on Sunday when network traffic is lightest. On Monday through Saturday, you back up changes made since Sunday's full backup on a daily basis. As the week progresses, each night's backup, the differential, takes a little longer. And finally, you have incremental backup. Again, you start with a full backup when network traffic is light. Then each night, you back up only that day's changes. As the week progresses, the nightly incremental backup takes about the same amount of time. It is faster to create the incremental weekday backups than the differential backups. This comes at a price, however. If you need to use the backup images to restore data, systems using differential backups would need to restore only the full backup and then the latest differential. Those using incremental backups would need to restore the full backup and then each day's incremental backups to complete the restore. You should back up items other than just data. These include router, switch, and other network device configurations, user access permissions and configurations, for example, Active Directory, and server and workstation operating systems and configurations. To make this more manageable, most large companies have a standard-based configuration for workstations that can be reloaded on demand. As long as you keep these up to date, patched and fixed, this is an attractive solution. As a reminder, an incident is an event that results in an actual or threatened violation of security policy. When an incident occurs, an organization needs to respond. The incident handling process includes the following steps. You have preparation, identification, notification, response, recovery and follow-up, documentation. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. Let's start with preparation. The first step in an incident response program is to plan how to best respond to a variety of incidents and to build the incident response team, or IRT. The IRT will have the training and documentation to respond to incidents as they occur. Members of the IRT should be comfortable enough with one another to communicate freely and handle each incident in a professional manner. The quality of the planning phase determines how well the IRT can handle incidents. Let's move to identification. The first step in actually handling an incident is to determine whether an incident has in fact taken place. Not all events are incidents. You must find out if the incident is serious or whether it is a common benign occurrence. This is triage, prioritizing the incident. You may receive initial notification of an incident from an alarm, a complaint from a user, an alert from a security vendor, or a log analysis. Make sure you have the procedures in place to react to any type of incident. Next is notification. You or another IRT member often will be one of the first people aware of an incident and must know how to react to it. As a first responder, it is important that you handle the incident properly from the beginning. The goal is to contain the incident and, if possible, to improve the situation. Take care not to make the situation worse. You must find out whether the event is a false positive or not. Be careful to make sure several false positives do not cause you to become desensitized to real events. A series of seemingly individual events taken independently might not justify a response. However, when taken collectively, they might be important. You must know how and when to escalate and whom to notify. This works well when you plan response scenarios and train incident response team members. Next is response. Once you identify an incident, the next phase is to limit the damage. An important aspect of this step is containment. Many incidents grow and expand rapidly, possibly affecting other systems, departments, and even business partners. The incident response plan must outline the steps that must be taken to stop the spread of the incident without causing unnecessary outages. For example, if a virus infects a system, a simple way to contain the threat is to unplug the system from the network. It is essential to have a plan. The odds are slim of correctly guessing the best course of action in the middle of an incident. Remember, people who have the benefit of time and hindsight will evaluate your response after the incident. A pre-approved response plan will lead to a better and more effective response while also providing you with blame reduction. It's essential to identify the source and type of incident so that you can enact proper recovery procedures. Fixing symptoms does not solve problems. The responders must find out the extent of the damage and possibly recommend the initiation of the disaster recovery plan if the damage is too severe. A key component of incident management is preventing future incidents. The logs and documentation gathered during the incident must be protected and available for future analysis. Next is recovery. After you have contained the incident and eliminated or blocked its source, it is time for you to recover. Before turning the system over to its normal use, you must deal with the exploited vulnerability so that it doesn't happen again right away. You might need to rebuild systems using ineffective applications and data backups. You might also have to clean malicious content from the system to prevent reinfection. And then you have follow-up. Learning from the incident will let management establish new procedures and controls to prevent or react to an incident more effectively in the future. It is important to conduct the lessons learned review of each incident to capture valuable information the IRT can use for future incidents. And finally is documentation and reporting. Don't ignore the importance of documenting every step in the incident response process. The documentation you create can be very valuable to the quality of future incidents. You can improve your incident response plan anytime you document what actions worked well and those that did not. As you accumulate incident response documentation, you build a valuable resource. You can use this resource to make changes to your incident response plan and your normal security policies and procedures. For example, documenting multiple incidents related to unauthorized personnel in the data center may indicate a need for better controls. Use the information you gain from documenting incident response. It can make your organization more secure. The disaster recovery plan does three things. It establishes an Emergency Operations Center, EOC, as an alternate location from which the BCP and DRP will be coordinated and implemented. It names an EOC manager, and it determines when that manager should declare incident or disaster. A DRP enables you to make critical decisions ahead of time. That way you can manage and review decisions without the urgency of an actual disaster. If you do not create these plans in advance, you and your managers will have to make best guess decisions under huge pressure. DRPs are long-term, time-consuming, expensive projects. The DRP for a large company can cost tens of millions of dollars. It is essential that senior management not only support but also insist upon an effective, well-tested DRP. The process starts with a business analysis. It identifies critical functions and their maximum tolerable downtimes. Then it identifies strategies for dealing with a wide variety of scenarios that might trigger the plan. As a security professional, you most likely will participate as a member of the disaster planning and disaster recovery teams. As a security professional, you will play a key role in reestablishing business operations in a crisis by rebuilding the networks and systems that the business requires. The recovery process involves two main phases. The first phase is to restore business operations. In many cases, the recovery might be at an alternate site. You may be required to build a network rapidly from available backup data, backup equipment, and any equipment that might be available from vendors. The second phase is to return operations to their original state before the disaster. To return to normal operations, you must rebuild the primary site. The transition back to the normal site and the closure of the alternate site should be part of the return to home site portion of the BCP DRP. Activate salvage and repair teams. They will do their work before people and data can return to the primary site. Security professionals are often on the repair team to rebuild the damaged parts of the network infrastructure. They will match or increase previous security levels. If you need new equipment, use this opportunity to improve security. During a crisis, many of the normal conditions such as controls, support, and processes might not be available. You must adapt quickly to ensure the security operations of systems, including backups and reconciliation of areas. Here are a few points to keep in mind. You may want to suspend normal processes such as separation of duties or spending limits. You should compensate with additional controls or by additional auditing. The DRP should give added privileges or spending authority to certain people or for certain tasks. If a number of systems are down, users might need more technical support or guidance on how to use alternate systems or access. The BIAs should have identified minimum recovery resources as part of the recovery needs. Next, during the disaster and recovery, it might be good to combine services that were on different hardware platforms onto common servers. This might speed up recovery. However, you must manage this process carefully to make sure that the movement and recovery go smoothly. And finally, while running at the alternate site, you must continue to make backups of data and systems. This might prevent new disasters if the recovery site fails. The primary steps to disaster recovery in order of importance are: number 1, ensure the safety of individuals. Number 2, contain the damage. And number 3, assess the damage and begin recovery operations according to the DRP and BCP. You must plan for rebuilding damaged systems also. You need to know where to get configuration charts, inventory lists, and backup applications and data. You must have access control lists to make sure that the system allows only legitimate users on it. Keep the following points in mind. First, once the rebuilding starts, the administrator must make sure to update the operating systems and applications with the most current patches. Backups or installation disks often contain older versions that are not current. Next, after you rebuild the system, you must restore the data to the RPO. This includes reconciling books and records. You must make sure that the operating systems and applications are current and secure. Next, some organizations overlook access control permissions and recovery plans. You must activate the access control rules, directories, and remote access systems to permit users to get on the new systems. When you are making the plan, be sure that any vendor's software will run on alternate processors. Some vendors license their products to operate only on a certain CPU. I want to give you a short list of disaster recovery issues that are often overlooked in the maintenance and execution of a DRP. I want you to keep these in mind. First are generators. Ensure all fuel is fresh and contracts are in place to guarantee a supply of fuel in a crisis. Generators must receive routine maintenance and should be run periodically to make sure they are ready to operate and capable of carrying the expected system load. You should look at safety of the damaged site. You must protect the primary or damaged site from further damage or looting. Third, look at re-entry. You must examine the damaged site using people who are qualified to determine whether it's safe for humans to re-enter. Next is transportation of equipment and backups. The plan must provide safe transportation of people, equipment, and backup data to and from the alternate site. And finally, communications and networks. Regular telephone service often fails in a crisis. You might need an alternate method of communication, especially among key team members. A business continuity coordinator considers each alternative's ability to support critical business functions, its operational readiness compared with the RTO, and the associated costs. He or she examines specifications for workspace, security requirements, IT, and telecommunications. 3 choices usually are considered if a business or some part of it has to be moved for recovery. First, a dedicated site operated by the business, such as a secondary processing center. Second, a commercially leased facility, such as a hot site or mobile facility. And third, an agreement with an internal or external facility. External commercial providers offer services to many organizations. That means if there is a disaster, it could affect many customers of a commercial provider. What priority will you have if this happens? Know your options along with prices for things such as test time, declaration, fees, and maximum recovery days. Make sure that the specifications for workspace, security requirements, IT, and telecommunications are suitable for your critical business functions. Ensure that suitable accommodations are available for staff, including facilities for resting and showering, as well as catering. No matter what choice your business makes, the IT department's job is to make sure all necessary equipment is available at the alternate site. This includes the critical files, documentation, and other items identified in the recovery categories. Other items can include additional patch cables, USB drives, and other common items IT personnel may use on a daily basis. This table compares the most common recovery site options. Regardless of where you choose to continue operations, you need a location to support your IT infrastructure. There are several options available, depending on cost and the time it takes to become operational. Here are the most common recovery location options. First, an alternate processing center is always ready and under the organization's control. It is the most expensive option because it requires full redundant or duplicate operations and synchronized data. The organization operates it continuously. Its additional costs might be justified by business needs, such as having a duplicate support staff other than recovery planning. However, making cost allocations is complex. Second, a hot site is one that can take over operations quickly. It has all the equipment and data already staged at the location, though you may need to refresh or update the data. There are 2 kinds of hot sites. One is company-owned and dedicated. The other is a commercial hot site. The hot site's advantage is that it can provide alternative computing facilities quickly, allowing rapid recovery. An internally owned hot site will be more expensive than some other alternatives, but no one else will compete for it during a regional disaster. A warm site is the next alternative. It has some common IT communications, power, and HVAC, but you will have to purchase and deliver IT equipment such as servers and communications. You will have to retrieve and log data as well. Many organizations own warm sites and often use them for off-site data storage. Next is a cold site. A cold site is an empty data center with HVAC and power. It is the least expensive option. It requires a lot of time to get up and running because you must purchase, deliver, and configure all equipment and telecommunications. Some organizations begin recovery in a hot site and transfer over to a warm site or a cold site if the interruption lasts a long time. This figure compares the most common recovery site options. In this lesson, you learn 3 core principles of information security. Identify the risks of the organizations and prevent damage as much as possible by using controls, and have plans and procedures ready to react to incidents that you cannot prevent. You can express these principles and controls in terms of people, process, technology, and data. In this lesson, you learn about the reasons and processes of risk management. You learn how a business continuity plan, or BCP, helps you make sure disruption doesn't put your organization out of business. You learn about risk assessment, including the difference between a quantitative risk assessment and a qualitative risk assessment. You learn the most common responses to risk and how they help you develop a risk reduction strategy. You learn about countermeasures and how to evaluate them. You learn the 3 types of activity controls and how they correspond to the security lifecycle. You learn how a response determines your organization's ability to deal with disruptions and disasters. You learned the 3 types of backups and what backup models you can use to recover from a disruption. Additionally, you learned the steps you must take for incident response and the role incident response plays in the risk, response, and recovery procedures. Finally, you learned the main steps to disaster recovery and the roles you play throughout the disaster recovery plan. That's it for this lesson, and I'll see you in lesson 9.